He's trying to leave without paying." The manager's voice sliced through the low hum of the Charlotte diner, sharp and accusatory. Every head turned. 17-year-old David froze, his hand barely on the door. He'd just given his own paid-for meal to an elderly couple whose card was declined. He had the receipt crumpled in his pocket, a tiny proof of his innocence. But the manager, a florid man named Henderson, saw none of that. He saw a tall black teenager in a hoodie moving toward the exit. And in his eyes, that was enough. The humiliation was a hot flush crawling up David's neck. He was being judged, convicted, and sentenced in a room full of strangers, and his voice was already lost in the roar of their assumptions. The clatter of cutlery ceased. The low murmur of conversations died in throats. In the sudden ringing silence of the landmark restaurant on Central Avenue, every eye was a spotlight, and David was trapped in the glare. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. 1 second, he had been filled with a quiet, warm satisfaction. The next, he was a spectacle. "Sir, you're mistaken," David said, his voice steadier than he felt. He turned slowly, deliberately keeping his hands visible, a lesson learned too young. "I already paid. My food is right over there." He gestured with his chin toward a booth in the corner, where an elderly couple was now looking on, their faces etched with confusion and alarm. The plate of country-fried steak and gravy, David's first proper meal out in 6 months, sat untouched before the old man. The manager, whose name tag read Henderson, puffed out his chest, his face a blotchy red. "Don't lie to me, son. I saw you. You ordered, sat down for 2 minutes, and now you're making a run for it. You think I was born yesterday?" A few patrons chuckled. Others looked away, suddenly fascinated by the salt shakers on their tables. Their discomfort was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket smothering the air. David's meal had been an extravagance, a reward to himself for finishing a brutal semester at North Mecklenburg High while juggling a part-time dishwashing job. The $30 he'd saved, folded neatly in his worn wallet, had felt like a king's ransom. He'd chosen the landmark because it smelled like his grandmother's kitchen used to, a comforting mix of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee. He hadn't had a grandmother, or a kitchen that felt like home, in a very long time. He'd been sketching in his notepad, a worn-out spiral-bound book filled with charcoal portraits, while he waited for his order. He'd drawn the old couple in the booth opposite him. The man, with his kind, crinkled eyes and thin frame, was helping his wife, whose hands trembled with a slight palsy, cut her food. They had a quiet intimacy that made David's chest ache with a hollow longing. When their bill came, he couldn't help but overhear. "Declined? Oh dear. Try it again, please," the woman had whispered, her voice fragile as antique lace. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, ran the card twice more before returning, her expression apologetic. David watched the husband's shoulders slump. He saw the wife's eyes well up. They were counting out loose change and a few crumpled dollar bills on the table, not nearly enough to cover their simple order of pancakes and coffee. It was a private moment of shame that David felt he was intruding upon, yet he couldn't look away. He knew that feeling, the cold dread of not having enough. He'd lived with it his entire life. Before he could talk himself out of it, he had walked to the counter, paid for his own meal, and then quietly asked the waitress to add the couple's bill to his. "And can you just box my steak up? I'll take it to go," he'd lied, knowing he couldn't afford both. When the waitress brought his food, he walked over to their booth. "Excuse me," he'd said softly. The couple looked up, startled. "I couldn't help but overhear. Please, have my dinner. It's already paid for." He placed the plate on their table. the aroma of gravy and onions rising between them. The old woman's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Oh, son, we couldn't possibly." "It's okay," David insisted, a shy smile touching his lips. "Really, enjoy it." He had turned to leave, the warmth of the small act a shield against the chilly October evening waiting for him outside. He didn't want their thanks or any fuss. He just wanted to go. That's when Henderson's voice had boomed across the diner. Now that warmth was gone, replaced by a familiar, freezing humiliation. "I'm not your son," David said, his voice low and tight. "And I'm not a thief. The receipt is in my pocket." "Let's see it then," Henderson sneered, holding out a thick, demanding hand. "Show me." The injustice of it was a physical blow. He had to prove his innocence against an assumption born of his skin color, his hoodie, his age. He slowly reached into his jeans pocket, the crinkle of the paper a small, lonely sound in the cavernous silence. His fingers brushed against the thin, flimsy proof. But before he could pull it out, the old man was on his feet, his movements slow but determined. "There's been a terrible mistake, sir," he said, his voice raspy with age but clear. "This young man, he just did the kindest thing. My wife and I, our card, it wasn't working. He bought us our breakfast and then he gave us his own dinner. We told him not to, but he insisted." Henderson's eyes flickered toward the couple, then back to David, his expression unchanged. It was clear he didn't believe a word of it. To him, this was just a more elaborate scam. "Nice try," Henderson said, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Got your accomplices all lined up, did you? An old couple, very clever. Makes for a good story." He took a step closer to David, invading his personal space. The sour smell of stale coffee was on his breath. "I'm calling the police. We'll see what they think of your little story." David's stomach dropped. The police. The word alone was a threat, a promise of a situation spiraling far beyond his control. All for a good deed. All because this man couldn't imagine a world where a boy who looked like him could be anything other than a criminal. He looked past Henderson, at the sea of faces watching him. No one met his gaze. In their silence, they were complicit, witnesses to a character assassination they refused to stop. The country fried steak, a symbol of a small victory, now felt like the price of his degradation. The diner, with its harsh fluorescent lights and silent staring patrons, faded into a blur. For a moment, David was no longer there. He was 6 years old, standing in a different, brightly lit room, a sterile social services office, clutching a worn teddy bear as a woman with a kind but tired face explained that his mother wasn't coming back. Not today. Not ever. That day was the beginning of his life as a file, a case number, a series of addresses in other people's homes. He became David Miller, ward of the state. He learned to pack his life into a single black trash bag, to make himself small and quiet, to never ask for too much or get too attached. Some homes were better than others. The Jacksons had a big backyard and a dog that would lick his face, but Mr. Jackson lost his job, and they couldn't afford an extra mouth to feed. The Garcias were loud and chaotic, with 5 of their own kids, and he was mostly invisible, which was a kind of peace. The worst was the Smiths, where the quiet was heavy and menacing, and Mr. Smith's temper was as unpredictable as a summer storm. He'd landed at the Northwood Group Home for Boys a year ago, a last stop for kids who had nowhere else to go. It was a clean, functional place run by the state, smelling perpetually of bleach and simmering frustration. It wasn't a home. It was a holding pen. There were about a dozen other boys there, each carrying their own invisible trash bag of trauma. They moved around each other with the wary caution of wounded animals, forming and breaking alliances, fighting over the remote control, and dreaming of the day they would age out and be free. David's only true escape was his art. His social worker, a perpetually stressed woman named Sarah Jenkins, had noticed his talent early on. When he was 10, she'd given him his first real sketchbook and a set of charcoal pencils. "You have a gift, David," she'd told him, her voice a rare note of genuine warmth in his sterile world. "You see people. Really see them." He drew everything. The tired lines around Sarah's eyes, the defiant posture of his roommate, Leo, the way the afternoon sun hit the peeling paint on the group home's windowsill. Sketching was the only way he could make sense of the world, the only way he could exert some control over it. On paper, he could capture the truth of a person, the story in their face, the weight on their shoulders. He could give them a dignity the world often denied them. His drawings weren't just images, they were testimonies. The $30 he'd saved for the meal at the Landmark was the result of 2 months of washing dishes at a local pizzeria, the hot water scalding his hands, the smell of grease clinging to his clothes. Every dollar was a small act of defiance. It was his money, earned with his own 2 hands. It meant he wasn't just a ward of the state. It meant he could buy himself a piece of normalcy, even if just for an hour. He'd dreamed of that steak, thick and crispy, smothered in creamy gravy, with a side of mashed potatoes and green beans. It was more than food. It was a taste of the life he saw other people living, the life of family dinners and easy laughter that he only ever got to watch from the outside. He thought of Sarah. She was always telling him to stay out of trouble, to keep his head down until he turned 18. "The world is already going to be hard on you, David," she'd said during their last meeting, her brow furrowed with worry. "You're a good kid, a smart kid, but you're a black kid in the system. That's 2 strikes before you even get up to bat. Don't give them a reason to call the third." He had tried. He got good grades. He stayed away from the boys at the home who were getting into drugs and petty crime. He was polite, respectful. He followed all the rules. He made himself as small and unobtrusive as possible, just as he'd been taught. But none of that mattered now. In the eyes of the man named Henderson, his very existence was a reason. His skin was the 3rd strike. The thought of his sketchbook, sitting on his lumpy bed back at the group home, sent a pang of despair through him. It was his most prized possession, the one thing that was entirely his. In its pages were his hopes, his fears, his observations. There was a portrait of the little girl who lived next door to one of his foster homes, her face full of a boundless joy he envied. There was a sketch of his own hands, calloused from work, holding a pencil. It was the only part of himself he truly recognized sometimes. He had wanted to draw the old couple, to capture the decades of shared life in the gentle way the husband looked at his wife. He wanted to add their story to his collection, a small moment of grace he had been privileged to witness. Now, their story had become tangled with his in the ugliest way possible. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. He was 12, living with the Smiths. Mrs. Smith's pearl necklace went missing. It was a family heirloom, she'd wailed. Mr. Smith had torn David's room apart, dumping his meager belongings on the floor. He'd grabbed David by the shirt, his face contorted in rage, screaming that he knew a thief when he saw one. David had sworn he didn't take it, his voice trembling. They found it a week later. It had fallen behind Mrs. Smith's dresser. There was no apology, just a grudging silence and the lingering sting of the accusation. He had learned then that for some people, his guilt was a foregone conclusion. All they needed was a pretext, and Henderson had found his. A kind act, twisted into a crime. The irony was so bitter it felt like poison in his throat. He had given away his one small luxury, his hard-earned moment of peace, out of a sense of shared humanity, and for that he was about to be arrested. He finally understood what Sarah meant. He could do everything right, and it could still all go wrong. The system wasn't just a series of buildings and case files. It was in the air he breathed, in the suspicious glances, in the assumptions that clung to him like a second skin. He was standing in the wreckage of his own good intentions, and he had never felt more alone. "I'm telling you, you've got it all wrong!" The old woman's voice was surprisingly strong, cutting through the tension. She was on her feet now, her frail body trembling with indignation. "He's a good boy, a hero." Henderson waved a dismissive hand at her, his focus entirely on David. "Ma'am, please sit down. This doesn't concern you. I'll deal with you and your partner's bill later." The implication was clear. They were part of the con, and their turn would come. The distant wail of a siren grew steadily closer, a sound that made David's blood run cold. This was really happening. Panic began to fray the edges of his composure. He had to think. He had to say the right thing, do the right thing. But what was the right thing when the rules were rigged? He met Henderson's gaze, forcing himself to keep his own expression neutral. "Sir, if you just let me show you my receipt." "You'll show it to the cops," Henderson snapped. "I'm not falling for whatever sleight of hand you're planning." The diner door swung open, and 2 police officers from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department stepped inside. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered white man, Officer Miller, whose jaw was set in a permanent scowl. His hand rested lightly on the butt of his gun, a casual gesture that was anything but. The second, Officer Evans, was younger, with a less imposing build and a watchful, analytical expression. "What's the situation here, Carl?" Officer Miller asked, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. He knew Henderson by name. David's heart sank a little further. "Hey, Frank," Henderson said, his tone shifting from belligerent to chummy. "Got a dine-and dasher here. Tried to make a run for it. Caught him just in time." He hooked a thumb toward David, a triumphant grin on his face. Officer Miller's eyes swept over David, a quick, dismissive appraisal from head to toe. The hoodie, the jeans, the color of his skin. David could feel the judgment clicking into place like a lock. He was a type, a problem. "That's not true," the old man, Mr. Peterson, interjected, stepping forward. "We tried to tell him. This young man paid for his meal and then gave it to us." Officer Miller barely glanced at him. "Sir, please let us handle this." He turned his attention back to David. "What's your name, son?" "David. David Miller." He hated that his voice came out as a slight croak. He cleared his throat. "And I'm not your son." A flicker of annoyance crossed the officer's face. "All right, David Miller. Let's see some ID." As David reached for his wallet, he felt a surge of a new, different kind of fear. His name was Miller. The officer's name was Miller. A stupid, meaningless coincidence that could be twisted into something else. Disrespect. Mockery. He was in a minefield, and every step was a risk. He handed over his state-issued ID, a flimsy card that identified him as a resident of the Northwood Group Home. Officer Miller took it, his eyes narrowing as he read the address. "Group Home, huh? You on probation?" "No, sir," David said, clenching his fists at his sides. "I've never been in trouble." "There's a first time for everything," Miller retorted, passing the ID to his partner. "Run it, Evans." While Officer Evans spoke quietly into his radio, Miller began his interrogation. "So what's the story here? You thought you'd get a free meal? Henderson says you tried to run." "That's not what happened," David said, his voice gaining strength from the sheer injustice of it all. He recounted the story calmly and clearly, how he'd saved his money, how he'd seen the couple struggling, how he'd paid for their meal and his own, and given his away. He even explained why he was leaving. "I didn't want them to feel like they owed me anything. I was just trying to leave quietly." Miller listened with an expression of profound disbelief. "That's a real nice story. You should write fiction." "It's the truth," Mrs. Peterson insisted, her voice trembling. "He has the receipt. Make him show you the receipt." Henderson scoffed. "Probably fake. These kids are pros. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on David's chest, making it hard to breathe. He was being systematically dismantled, his character, his intentions, his very words treated as lies. He was no longer a person. He was a problem to be managed. He looked at the other people in the diner. Some were now openly staring, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A woman in a nearby booth pulled her purse a little closer. No one spoke up for him. Not one. Officer Evans finished his radio call. "He's clean, Frank. No record." Miller seemed almost disappointed. He handed the ID back to David. "Clean for now. Doesn't mean you didn't do it." He turned to Henderson. "You want to press charges for theft?" "You're damn right I do," Henderson said, nodding vigorously. "Got to make an example of them, or they'll think they can get away with anything." David felt the floor drop out from under him. Charges. A record. Everything Sarah had warned him about was coming true. His future, his chances of getting into a community college program for art, his dream of making a life for himself, all of it could be erased in this greasy spoon diner because of one man's prejudice. "Wait," Officer Evans said, speaking up for the first time. He looked from Henderson to David, and then to the elderly couple. "Let's just see the receipt. It'll clear everything up, one way or another." His tone was reasonable, a stark contrast to his partner's aggression. For the first time, a tiny spark of hope flickered within David. "I told you, it's a waste of time," Miller grumbled, but he didn't stop David from reaching into his pocket. Slowly, his fingers shaking slightly now, David pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it and held it out. It was all there. The date, the time, the country-fried steak, the extra order of pancakes and coffee. And at the bottom, the words, "Paid in full." Evans took the receipt and examined it. He walked over to the cash register and compared the transaction number. He came back, his expression unreadable. He looked at his partner. He looked at Henderson. "It's legit. He paid for everything. Total was $28.50. Paid in cash." The silence in the diner was deafening. Henderson's face went from red to a pale, sickly white. Officer Miller's jaw tightened. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson looked on, their expressions flooded with relief. David expected an apology. He expected the shame to transfer from him to his accusers. He was wrong. Miller just shrugged. "All right, so he paid. Still caused a public disturbance. Look at this whole scene you've caused." "I caused?" David asked, his voice shaking with a rage he could no longer contain. "He's the one who screamed across the diner. He's the one who called you." "Watch your tone," Miller warned, taking a step forward. "You're walking a thin line." "This is insane," Mr. Peterson said, shaking his head. "You're harassing this young man after he performed an act of charity." Officer Evans finally stepped between his partner and David. "Frank, let's just go. There's nothing here." He turned to David. "You're free to go. Sorry for the misunderstanding." The apology was quiet, almost perfunctory, but it was something. David snatched the receipt from Evans's hand. He didn't say a word. He looked at Henderson, whose face was now a mask of sullen anger. He looked at Miller, who was glaring at him with pure, undiluted animosity. And he looked at the patrons, who were now pointedly avoiding his eyes, ashamed not of the injustice, but of being caught watching it. Without another glance at anyone, David turned and walked out the door, the little bell chiming his exit. The cold air hit him like a slap, but it wasn't as cold as the feeling in his gut. He hadn't been arrested, but he felt like a criminal anyway. He had been stripped bare in public, and his innocence had barely been enough to save him. The walk back to the group home was a blur of gray pavement and indifferent traffic. Each step felt heavy, as if the concrete were trying to pull him down. The 3 miles stretched into an eternity. The anger that had surged inside the diner had cooled into a familiar, leaden despair. He clutched the crumpled receipt in his hand, a flimsy testament to an ugly truth. His innocence was conditional, his character always on trial. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind. The smug certainty on Henderson's face, the casual menace of Officer Miller, the averted eyes of the other customers. They hadn't seen a person. They had seen a stereotype, a story they'd already written in their heads. And his act of kindness? It didn't fit their narrative, so they'd erased it, dismissed it as a trick. The memory of the woman pulling her purse closer sent a fresh wave of shame through him. He slipped into the group home unnoticed. The common room was filled with the usual cacophony of a video game and two boys arguing over a bag of chips. No one looked up. He was grateful for the invisibility. He went straight to his room, a small cramped space he shared with Leo, who was, thankfully, not there. The room was bare except for two beds, two small dressers, and a single desk cluttered with David's art supplies. He sank onto his lumpy mattress, the springs groaning in protest. He stared at the blank wall, his mind empty. He didn't have the energy to be angry anymore. He just felt tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with the long walk and everything to do with the emotional gauntlet he had just endured. This was the exhaustion of fighting a battle you could never truly win. The weariness of constantly having to prove you belonged in rooms you had every right to be in. He pulled out his sketchbook, the smooth, worn cover a small comfort in his hands. He opened it to a fresh page, picked up a charcoal pencil, and tried to draw. He wanted to capture the injustice, to pour the rage and humiliation onto the page. But his hands felt clumsy, disconnected. The lines came out shaky and wrong. He couldn't create. The ugliness of the diner had followed him home and poisoned his one sanctuary. Frustrated, he snapped the book shut and threw it onto his desk. What was the point? What was the point of trying to be good, of trying to see the beauty in the world, when the world was so determined to see the worst in him? Sarah's words echoed in his ears. Don't give them a reason. He hadn't. He had done the opposite of giving them a reason. He had shown compassion, and in return, he'd been treated like a criminal. Maybe the cynical boys in the group home were right. Maybe the only way to survive was to stop caring, to build a wall around yourself so thick that nothing could get in. A knock on the door startled him. It was Mr. Davies, the evening supervisor, a harried man in his 50s with a permanent look of exhaustion. "Miller, you got a phone call," he said, not unkindly. "It's on the office line." David's stomach tightened. A phone call could only mean one thing: bad news. It was probably Sarah, having heard from the police. He braced himself for a lecture, for the disappointment in her voice. He trudged down the hall to the small, cluttered office and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he said, his voice flat. "Is this David? David Miller?" a woman's voice asked. It was shaky but familiar. "Yes, who is this?" "Oh, thank goodness. This is Eleanor Peterson. From the diner? My husband George and we were so worried about you, dear." It was the old woman. David was so stunned he couldn't speak for a moment. He had expected to never hear from them again. "We are just so terribly sorry for what happened," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "That man, the manager, and that police officer. It was disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. We tried to get your name, but they rushed you out so fast. The other officer, the younger one, he was kind enough to give us the contact information for your group home. We hope you don't mind us calling." "No, it's okay," David managed to say, sinking into the lumpy office chair. "George and we haven't stopped thinking about you," she went on. "That was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for us. We've had a hard time lately with my medical bills, and we were so embarrassed. And you, a complete stranger, showed us such grace. For you to be treated that way in return, it just breaks my heart." Tears pricked at David's eyes. He swallowed hard, fighting them back. Her words were a soothing balm on a raw wound. She saw him. She saw what he had done, and she saw the injustice of what had been done to him. "My husband wants to speak to you," she said. And then there was a rustling sound before a man's raspy voice came on the line. "David, George Peterson here. Son, I want you to know you're a good man, a better man than I've met in a long time. What happened today was wrong, and we won't let it stand. We won't." There was a fierce determination in his voice. "People like that manager, they can't be allowed to get away with treating people that way. It's not right." They talked for a few more minutes. They asked if he was okay. They told him again how grateful they were. They took his personal cell number, a cheap prepaid phone he used for emergencies, and promised to call again. When he hung up, the office felt different. The despair that had been suffocating him had receded, just enough for him to breathe. It wasn't a solution. It didn't erase the humiliation or change the systemic prejudice that had caused it. But it was something. It was a connection. It was two people reaching back to him from across the chasm of that awful experience, offering a hand. Their phone call was a quiet act of witness, a refusal to be silent. It was a single candle lit in a vast darkness. David walked back to his room, the leaden weight in his limbs feeling a little lighter. He picked up his sketchbook from the desk, his fingers tracing the familiar spiral binding. He opened it to the blank page that had mocked him just an hour before. This time, when he put the charcoal to the paper, his hand was steady. He didn't draw Henderson's sneer or Miller's glare. He didn't draw the anonymous, accusing faces in the diner. He drew Eleanor Peterson's eyes, shimmering with a mixture of gratitude and righteous anger. He drew George Peterson's hand, gnarled with age, resting protectively on his wife's arm. He sketched them not as victims, but as allies. As he drew, he felt a shift inside him. The incident in the diner was a part of his story now, a deep and painful scar. But it wasn't the whole story. The Petersons' call had reminded him of that. Kindness was also part of the story. So was courage. So was the simple, profound act of seeing another person's humanity. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the Petersons' outrage would lead to anything. But as he shaded the lines on George's face, capturing the fierce loyalty in his expression, David felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt all day. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something smaller but perhaps more resilient. It was hope. The next day dawned gray and drizzly, the sky over Charlotte the color of dishwater. The mood perfectly matched David's. The hope from the Petersons' call had been a temporary reprieve, a flicker of warmth in the night, but the morning brought back the chill of reality. He went through the motions of his day in a fog. School, where the words of his teachers seemed to float past him unheard. His dishwashing job, where he scrubbed pans with a mechanical fury, the repetitive motion a welcome distraction. The memory of the diner lingered like a phantom limb, an ache that reminded him of what he'd lost. Not the meal, but a piece of his faith in the world. He returned to the group home just as dusk was settling, the drizzling rain turning the streetlights into blurry halos. He was mentally and physically drained, looking forward to nothing more than retreating to his room and his sketchbook. But as he walked up the cracked concrete path, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Parked at the curb in front of the rundown building was a car that was so out of place it looked like it had been teleported from another dimension. It was a sleek, black Lincoln Town car, polished to a mirror shine, its windows tinted so darkly they reflected the dreary sky like pools of oil. In a neighborhood of dented sedans and rusted pickup trucks, it was an alien spacecraft. Standing on the porch, speaking to Mr. Davies, was a man who matched the car. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. He was black, his hair cut short and flecked with silver at the temples. He radiated an aura of calm, unshakable authority. He held himself with a stillness and confidence that David had only ever seen in movies. Mr. Davies, looking flustered and unusually respectful, spotted David. "Ah, David. There you are. This gentleman is here to see you." David's mind raced. Who could this possibly be? Was he from social services? A detective? Had the diner incident escalated somehow? A knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. He cautiously approached the porch, his eyes darting from the strange man to the expensive car and back again. The man turned his full attention to David, and his expression softened. He had kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. They were familiar eyes. "David Miller?" the man asked, his voice a deep, smooth baritone. "My name is Marcus Harrison. I believe you met my parents yesterday, George and Eleanor Peterson." David stared at him, dumbfounded. Peterson? This man was their son? The elderly, financially struggling couple from the diner had a son who looked like he owned half the city. The pieces didn't fit. Mr. Harrison offered a small, sad smile, as if sensing his confusion. "I know. It's a lot to take in. May we speak somewhere a bit more private?" Mr. Davies, practically tripping over himself to be helpful, offered his office. A moment later, David found himself sitting opposite Marcus Harrison in the same lumpy chair where he'd taken the Petersons' call the night before. The small, cluttered room seemed to shrink around the man's presence. "First," Mr. Harrison began, his voice low and serious, "I want to offer you my deepest, most profound apology for what you endured on behalf of my parents. And I want to thank you. They called me last night, after they spoke with you. They told me everything, about their card being declined, about your incredible generosity, and about the disgusting racist treatment you received as a result." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. "What you did for them was an act of profound human decency. What was done to you was a disgrace." David didn't know what to say. He just nodded, overwhelmed. "My parents, they're proud people," Harrison continued, a hint of pain in his voice. "They would never ask me for help. Not in a million years. I set up their accounts, their retirement funds. I check on them constantly. What happened yesterday was a fluke, a bank error, a security freeze on their card because they'd bought something online from a new store, an easily fixable problem. But in that moment, for them, it was deeply humiliating. And you stepped in and shielded them from that. A boy with next to nothing gave them everything he had. I can't begin to tell you what that means to me." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. "My father told me what he said to you on the phone, that he wouldn't let it stand. He meant it. And so do I. I'm a lawyer, David, a civil rights attorney, to be specific. And what happened at the Landmark restaurant wasn't just rude or unfair, it was illegal. It was textbook public accommodation discrimination, racial profiling, and defamation." David listened, the legal terms washing over him. He'd never imagined the incident in those terms. To him, it had just been life, a bad day, a painful reminder of his place in the world. This manager, Henderson, and that officer, they operate with impunity because they believe their victims have no voice, no power, and no recourse, Harrison said, his voice hardening. They are about to find out they are mistaken. He looked at David, his expression softening again. "But before I proceed, I need your permission. You are the victim here. I will not move forward without your blessing. I understand if you want to just put this behind you. But if you are willing, I want to help you fight back. Not just for you, but for every other kid who might walk into that diner and be judged by the same prejudice." The offer hung in the air between them. A chance not just for revenge, but for justice. A chance to have a voice. For years, David had felt powerless, a piece of driftwood tossed about on the currents of a system he couldn't control. Now, this powerful, articulate man was offering him an oar. He was offering to stand with him. David thought of the humiliation. He thought of his sketchbook, of his stolen sense of peace. He thought of the Petersons and their fierce, protective anger on his behalf. And he thought of all the other times he'd been made to feel small, insignificant, and invisible. He straightened up in his chair, meeting Marcus Harrison's gaze without flinching. "What do you need me to do?" David asked, his voice quiet but firm. A slow, determined smile spread across Marcus Harrison's face. It was the smile of a man who knew how to fight and how to win. "For now," he said, standing up, "you don't have to do anything but be willing to tell the truth. I'll handle the rest." He paused at the door. "Actually, there is one more thing. I'd like you to come with me. We're going to pay a visit to Mr. Henderson. I think it's time he and I had a conversation." Riding in the back of the Lincoln Town car felt like entering another world. The scent of rich leather filled the air, and the city's sounds were muted to a distant hum. It was a cocoon of quiet luxury, a stark contrast to the rattling city bus David usually rode. He sat in the plush seat, his worn jeans and hoodie feeling suddenly out of place. Beside him, Marcus Harrison was silent, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked streets of Charlotte passing by. He wasn't angry or agitated. He was perfectly, unnervingly calm. It was the calm of a chess master contemplating the board, seeing a dozen moves ahead. When they pulled up to the landmark restaurant, the lunchtime rush was in full swing. The parking lot was crowded, the windows steamy. For a heart-stopping moment, David wanted to tell him to keep driving. He didn't want to go back in there. He didn't want to see Henderson's face or feel the weight of all those eyes on him again. As if reading his mind, Harrison turned to him. "You don't have to say a word if you don't want to, David. I just need you to be present. I need him to see you. I need him to understand that you are not invisible and you are not alone." His words were a strange sort of armor. David took a deep breath, nodded, and opened the car door. They walked in together, Harrison holding the door for David. The little bell chimed, the same sound that had marked his humiliating exit the day before. This time it sounded different, like a proclamation. A few heads turned, drawn by the stark contrast of the two figures, the impeccably dressed lawyer and the quiet, watchful teenager in a hoodie. Henderson was behind the counter, barking orders at a waitress. He glanced up, a flicker of annoyance on his face at the new arrivals. Then his eyes landed on David. A sneer instantly formed on his lips. "You've got a lot of nerve coming back here," he began, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I should have had you arrested for trespassing yesterday." Harrison stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of David. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his tone was enough to cut through the diner's noise. "Are you Mr. Henderson, the manager on duty?" he asked, his voice smooth as polished stone. Henderson's eyes flickered to Harrison, taking in the expensive suit. His bravado faltered for a fraction of a second. He clearly wasn't sure who he was dealing with. "Yeah, I'm the manager. Who's asking?" "My name is Marcus Harrison," he said, pulling a sleek leather card holder from his jacket and placing a business card on the counter. "I am an attorney, and I am representing Mr. David Miller." Henderson stared at the card. "Harrison and Locke, PLLC, Attorneys at Law." The name of one of the most prominent law firms in the state. The sneer on Henderson's face vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He looked from the card to Harrison, then to David, as if trying to make the pieces of an impossible puzzle fit together. "You're his lawyer?" he stammered. "I am," Harrison confirmed, "and we are here to discuss the events that transpired in this establishment at approximately 6:45 p.m. yesterday evening, events during which you, acting as an agent of this restaurant, racially profiled, publicly defamed, and wrongfully attempted to have my client arrested." He let the words hang in the air. The waitress Henderson had been yelling at was now frozen mid-step, a coffee pot in her hand. The customers at the counter had stopped eating. "Now I didn't," Henderson sputtered, his face beginning to turn a familiar blotchy red, but this time it was from panic, not rage. He was trying to skip out on his bill. I was just doing my job. No, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous register. You were not doing your job. Your job is to manage a restaurant. What you did was assume, based on nothing more than my client's appearance, that he was a thief. You ignored eyewitness testimony from other patrons who tried to tell you the truth. You summarily dismissed proof in the form of a valid receipt. And you used your position of authority to humiliate a minor in a public space. That is not your job. That is a series of tortious actions for which you and your employer will be held liable. David stood by, watching the scene unfold. It was surreal. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely inverted. Henderson, who had been the picture of smug authority the day before, was now crumbling, his bluster dissolving into beads of sweat on his forehead. And David, the powerless kid from the group home, was now the client of a man who wielded the law like a surgeon's scalpel. Furthermore, Harrison continued, his voice relentless, we have the full names and contact information for the elderly couple you also harassed and accused of being my client's accomplices. You may be interested to learn that they are my parents. That was the final blow. Henderson physically recoiled, as if he'd been struck. The blood drained from his face. He looked at David with a new, horrified understanding. The kid he had tried to have arrested for stealing a $30 meal was connected to this man. He had bullied the parents of a legal powerhouse. I didn't know, he whispered, his voice cracking. I had no idea. It was a misunderstanding. It was not a misunderstanding, Harrison corrected him, his voice cold and precise. A misunderstanding is getting an order wrong. What you did was an act of deliberate prejudice. You saw a young black man, and you assumed he was a criminal. You refused to entertain any evidence to the contrary. The only misunderstanding was on your part. You misunderstood who you were dealing with. You assumed my client was voiceless. You assumed he was powerless. You assumed he was alone. Harrison paused and took a half step back, gesturing toward David. For the first time, Henderson was forced to look directly at the boy he had terrorized. David met his gaze. He didn't glare. He didn't smile. His expression was calm, steady, and unwavering. In his quiet dignity, there was a power more profound than all of Henderson's blustering. I am truly sorry, Henderson mumbled, his eyes pleading. Please, tell your client, I'm sorry, I can apologize. An apology is insufficient, Harrison stated flatly. An apology does not undo the damage. It does not erase the humiliation. It does not address the systemic rot that allows men like you to feel so comfortable in your bigotry that you can display it openly without fear of consequence. He picked his business card up from the counter. You will be hearing from my office, Mr. Henderson. So will the corporate ownership of the landmark restaurant chain. I suggest you retain counsel. Without another word, Harrison turned, placed a steadying hand on David's shoulder, and guided him toward the door. They walked out of the diner, leaving a trail of stunned silence in their wake. Henderson stood frozen behind the counter, a man who had just watched his entire world implode. The little bell chimed their exit, a final, definitive note. This time it sounded like the ringing of a bell for justice. The confrontation at the diner was only the beginning. Marcus Harrison was not a man who made idle threats. The very next morning, a formal notice of intent to sue was delivered via courier to the Landmark Restaurant's corporate headquarters in Raleigh. The lawsuit cited civil rights violations, defamation of character, and emotional distress, naming both the parent company and Carl Henderson personally. The story, predictably, exploded. A junior associate at Harrison's firm leaked the initial filing to a reporter at the Charlotte Observer. The headline was sensational and irresistible. Teenage Good Samaritan, falsely accused of theft in viral act of kindness, represented by prominent attorney. The article detailed the entire incident. David's selfless act, Henderson's racist assumptions, the humiliating police encounter, and the stunning revelation that the elderly couple were the parents of Marcus Harrison. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Social media was a firestorm of indignation. The Landmark's Yelp and Google review pages were flooded with one-star ratings and furious comments. Justice for David began trending locally. News vans camped out in front of the diner, which was forced to temporarily close its doors due to the deluge of negative attention. For David, the sudden spotlight was disorienting. He was no longer an anonymous kid from a group home. He was a symbol. Reporters tried to contact him, but Harrison shielded him completely, handling all media inquiries. "Your only job is to focus on being a kid," he told David firmly. "Let me handle the noise." The consequences for the antagonists were swift and severe. The Landmark's corporate office, facing a PR nightmare and a lawsuit from a notoriously tenacious lawyer, went into full damage control mode. Carl Henderson was fired within 48 hours, his termination announced in a public statement that was heavy on apologies and promises of reform. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department launched an internal affairs investigation into Officer Miller's conduct. Body cam footage, which Harrison's firm immediately subpoenaed, confirmed David's and the Petersons' account of Miller's aggressive and unprofessional behavior. He was placed on administrative leave pending the results of the investigation. But Harrison wanted more than just a few heads on a platter. He saw this as an opportunity for real, institutional change. He entered into negotiations with the restaurant chain's lawyers. He didn't just want a financial settlement for David, though that would be substantial. He demanded a comprehensive overhaul of their corporate policies. The final settlement was groundbreaking. In addition to a significant, confidential sum placed in a trust for David, the Landmark chain agreed to implement mandatory, company-wide implicit bias and de-escalation training for all employees, from bussers to executives. They also agreed to partner with a local non-profit to create a second-chance hiring program for youth aging out of the foster care system. Throughout this whirlwind, a remarkable transformation was happening in David's personal life. Marcus Harrison wasn't just his lawyer. He became a mentor, a guide, a figure of unwavering support. He and David met several times a week, not just to discuss the case, but to talk about life. Harrison asked David about his art, his dreams, his fears. He looked through David's sketchbook with a genuine, profound interest. "You have a voice in these drawings, David," Harrison said one afternoon, carefully turning the pages. "You capture people's souls." He paused on the drawing of his parents. "You saw them. Not just two old people, but them. Their strength, their love. That's a rare gift." For the first time, David felt seen, not as a case number or a cause, but as a person with a future. Harrison's belief in him was a powerful antidote to the years of feeling disposable. The Petersons became a constant, warm presence in his life. They called him every few days. They insisted he come over for Sunday dinner. Walking into their small, cozy home felt, for the first time in over a decade, like coming home. Eleanor, or Ellie, as she insisted he call her, would fuss over him, piling his plate high with pot roast and mashed potatoes. George would sit with him on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. Baseball, the weather, the old days in Charlotte. They filled a void in his heart he didn't even know was there. They were the grandparents he'd never had. One evening, after one of Ellie's Sunday dinners, Marcus Harrison drove David back to the group home. The lawsuit had been settled for a week, and a new, quieter routine was beginning to form. "David," Harrison said, turning to him in the parked car, his expression serious, "we need to talk about your future. The money from the settlement is in a trust. It will pay for your college education, a car, a place to live, anything you need to get started in life. It's your security." David nodded, his mind still reeling at the number of zeros in the trust fund documents. "But it's more than that," Harrison continued. "My parents..." They love you. And my wife and I, we've been talking. We know you're almost 18, and you'll be aging out of the system soon. But you shouldn't have to face the world alone." He took a breath. "We want to offer you a home, with us, not as a guest, but as family. We would like to become your legal guardians, if that's something you would even consider." The offer was so enormous, so far beyond anything David had ever allowed himself to dream of, that he couldn't process it. A family. A real, permanent family. People who chose him. Tears welled in his eyes, the kind he hadn't shed since he was 6 years old in that sterile office, clutching his teddy bear. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. "Yes," he whispered, his voice thick. "Yes, I would." Harrison smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He placed a hand on David's shoulder, the same gesture he had used walking out of the diner. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just support. It was a welcome. An anchor in a world that had always felt like a storm. David was no longer just a ward of the state. He was on a new path. He was going home. The story of David Miller did not end with the lawsuit settlement or his new family. In fact, that was where it truly began. The ripples from that one ugly incident in a Charlotte diner spread farther than anyone could have anticipated, creating waves of change in their wake. A local news station, WCNC Charlotte, produced an in-depth feature on David's story. It wasn't just about the diner, it was about his life. With his permission and the guidance of Marcus Harrison, the piece delved into the realities of the foster care system. They interviewed Sarah Jenkins, his overworked but dedicated social worker who spoke passionately about the lack of resources and the challenges faced by kids on the verge of aging out. The segment featured David's artwork, panning slowly over the charcoal portraits in his sketchbook. His drawings, filled with such raw emotion and empathy, became the silent, powerful narrator of his journey. The response was a deluge. The station was flooded with calls and emails. People weren't just angry about the injustice at the diner anymore. They were moved by the quiet resilience of a boy who had been overlooked by society. A local art gallery owner saw the segment and immediately contacted Harrison. A month later, David had his first exhibition, Portraits from the Margins. The gallery was packed on opening night. People saw the faces David had drawn, the hopeful, the tired, the defiant, and they saw the humanity he had captured. He sold nearly every piece, with all the proceeds going to a charity for foster youth that Harrison helped him establish. His art had become his advocacy. The changes at the landmark restaurant chain were real and visible. The new training programs, designed by a diversity and inclusion consulting firm Harrison recommended, became a model for the local service industry. The story served as a stark warning to other businesses about the cost of prejudice, not just in legal fees, but in public trust. The internal affairs investigation concluded that Officer Frank Miller had violated multiple department protocols, demonstrating a clear pattern of bias and excessive aggression. He was fired from the CMPD. His dismissal sent a shockwave through the department, a clear message that the old ways of policing, protected by a thin blue line of silence, were no longer untouchable. Officer Evans, the younger officer who had intervened, was commended for his professionalism and became a leading voice in a departmental task force on community relations and de-escalation. But the most profound changes were the ones that happened within David himself. Living with Marcus, his wife, and their 2 young daughters was a revelation. It was the small things that meant the most. Family dinners filled with laughter and arguments about whose turn it was to clear the table. The comforting rhythm of a stable, loving home. Marcus helping him with his homework. His wife, a graphic designer, showing him new techniques on her computer. The girls treating him like a revered older brother. He was no longer a guest or a temporary resident. He was a son, a brother. He belonged. He kept his room at the Northwood group home in his memory. He didn't try to forget the years of uncertainty and loneliness. They were part of him, the shadows that gave his present light its depth and meaning. He and Marcus started a mentorship program, connecting professionals in the community with teenagers about to age out of the foster system. David would visit the group homes, not as a cautionary tale, but as a story of hope. He'd sit with the boys, share his sketchbook, and listen to their stories. He would tell them, "You are not invisible. Your story matters." George and Ellie Peterson were at every milestone. They were in the front row at his art show, beaming with pride. They were at his high school graduation, Ellie dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and George clapping him on the back so hard he nearly stumbled. They took him to his first Hornets game. They taught him how to change a tire. They were, in every sense of the word, his grandparents. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the incident, David found himself driving past the landmark restaurant. A new sign was out front, and the building had been repainted. It looked different, scrubbed clean of the past. He pulled into the parking lot on an impulse and went inside. The diner was busy, the atmosphere light and cheerful. A young black woman was managing the counter, laughing with a customer. A diverse mix of patrons filled the booths. He sat down and ordered a coffee. As the waitress set the cup down, she smiled a genuine, welcoming smile. It was just a small, ordinary moment. But for David, it felt like a revolution. He took a sip of his coffee and pulled out his sketchbook. He looked around the diner at the faces of the people sharing a meal, and he began to draw. The lines flowed from his pencil, confident and sure. He wasn't drawing to escape anymore. He was drawing to celebrate. He was sketching a picture of the world as it could be, a world where a simple act of kindness wouldn't be twisted into a crime, a world where every person was seen, and a world where a second chance was not just a dream, but a reality. And in the quiet, steady movement of his hand across the page, David Miller, the boy who was once invisible, was finally, fully, the author of his own story. In the end, a single act of kindness, met with bitter prejudice, sparked a revolution of compassion and accountability. David's life was transformed as he found not just a family in the Harrisons and the Petersons, but also his voice as an artist and advocate. The manager and police officer who wronged him faced tangible consequences, leading to systemic changes within their institutions and sending a clear message through the community. The incident at the landmark became a catalyst, proving that one person's story, when amplified by allies, can challenge deep-seated biases and inspire lasting change. Thank you for watching this story of resilience and justice. If you were moved by David's journey, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that highlights the power of the human spirit. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of David's story resonated with you the most?